All right, thank you, Taylor. Well, welcome everyone today. We're really looking forward to our presentation with Eric Carpio, titled History, Art, and Place, Buffalo Soldiers in the American West. And so before we jump into that, apologies, everyone. We will just start off with the land acknowledgement. The Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits. Our work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions. And yeah, thank you all so much for your support of all the work we're doing here. Just a brief little introduction on Zoom. If you have any questions, type them in the little Q&A box rather than the chat. We'll be able to get to them there pretty easily. And if you're having difficulties on Zoom, you can also live stream at Facebook. And if you miss or need to log off soon, you can always watch our videos on YouTube. And later on, any of you who have questions, if you would like to explicitly share your name, we would be happy to do that too. But just leave a note in your message, and we'd be happy to do that. So the next couple weeks, we have some awesome webinars coming to you. Crow Canyon's very own John Jihadi will be presenting Autonomy, Core Element of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt on August 8th. And on August 15th, we have Dr. Michael Charles presenting on Indigenous food sovereignty and land grant institutions, a forgotten debt. And there will be no webinar next week, I believe. Yep. And so thank you all again so much for all your contributions. It really allows us to reach a much broader audience than we would otherwise. So thank you all so much. And from the Research Institute, new work from Dr. Susan Ryan in a blog post. Defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a calling to remembrance or preserving in memory. Commemoration acts have been practiced for as long as we have been humans. In her latest blog post, she considers acts of commemoration detected in the archaeological record and Crow Canyon's work in the Goodman Point community. And you can visit our website here for that and a lot of other news that we have coming from our campus. So without further ado, we will get started into today's presentation, which will be in the format of a short film and then presentation and then Q&A after that. For this presentation here, History, Place, and Fine Art Intersect in Buffalo Soldiers, Revision, an exhibition at the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, for an examination of the complicated legacy of the all-Black Army regiments established in 1866 following the Civil War. Known as Buffalo Soldiers, these regiments, including the 9th Cavalry, who were stationed at Fort Garland from 1875 to 1879, played an important role in American westward expansion and the displacement of Indigenous populations. Through the lens of multi-ethnic, multi-gender team of artists from across the U.S., Buffalo Soldiers Revision disrupts common narratives of manifest destiny and presents an opportunity to reconcile some of the most difficult aspects of our collective past. This presentation will include a short film following the artist's journey of discovery and creation. And today's presenter, Eric Carpio, is the Chief Community Museum Officer for History Colorado and the Director of the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center. Fort Garland was selected as a finalist for the 2023 National Medal, the nation's highest honor for museums and libraries, by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Recent exhibitions include Unsilenced, Indigenous Enslavement in Southern Colorado, Merciless Indian Savages, and Buffalo Soldiers Revision, and have gained local, state, and national recognition. In 2019, Eric was selected as one of 10 senior fellows for diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion for the American Alliance of Museums. Eric has a BS from Colorado State University and MA from Adams State University. He is an alumnus of the University of Denver's Latino Leadership Institute and the University of Pennsylvania Center for Social Impact Strategy. So we're really excited to have you, Eric. Thank you again. And I'll stop sharing here for Taylor to begin the video.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to everybody joining us across the Southwest and across the country. And of course, thank you to the Crow Canyon Archaeological Association for the invitation to share our work here at the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center. As Rebecca said, my name is Eric Carpio. I'm the director of the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, and also History Colorado's chief community museum officer. Before we jump into the film, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about today's presentation and the work that we'll be doing. As Rebecca mentioned, we're going to start off with a short film that'll follow the 8 artists that we collaborated with and their journey of discovery and creation for this exhibition. The exhibition opened in June of 2023, so just over a year ago. The 9th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, was stationed here at Fort Garland, and I'll get into more of this during my presentation. But for a long time, we have here at the museum had an exhibition devoted to Buffalo Soldier history and the significance of, African American soldiers in the West. But this particular project was important to us because we know that history is complicated. Often many Buffalo soldiers were formerly enslaved. This was, one of the only opportunities. Military service was one of the few opportunities that, formerly enslaved Black men and women, in some cases, had to provide for themselves and for their family. And so it's a history that is often, recognized and celebrated, and in some ways should be. But it's also complicated because the role that Buffalo soldiers were often played was, they were sent out west to participate in westward expansion and manifest destiny and their displacement of Indigenous people across the Southwest. So what Revision does is try to dig into some of that complicated nature of the history. And we felt there was no better way to explore some of that history than to partner with artists. And so, this film that we'll see will kind of introduce each of the artists, introduce the project. It's about 15 minutes. And then from there, like I said, I'll share a little bit more context, share some of the pieces that were created, and then open it up to Q&A. But Taylor, I think I'll pass it off to you to start the film.
The San Luis Valley is in an area that we call or refer to as the borderlands of southern Colorado. That area is also, overlaid by land that has been occupied and traveled through by several indigenous communities, really for thousands of years. The valley is at the very northern edge of early Spanish settlement, and it's where that meets American westward expansion. And so it's a space of convergence. It's a space where people have come together, sometimes in really beautiful and amazing ways, sometimes in really tragic and complicated ways.
To walk around a place like this and not necessarily feel a sense of agency as a person of color, I guess feeling some resonance or seeing how my history, my life story connects to some of these local stories is what attracts me. I never imagined myself collaborating with a historical society, but I enjoy a good story.
I think one of the stories that is undertold when we talk about the West is the story of African Americans in the West. The history of black cowboys, the history of Buffalo Soldiers. This project aims to, shine a light on African American contributions to the West. Many Buffalo Soldiers were formerly enslaved before they joined the service, and so it's a story as well about freedom and aspiration and resilience, while also again looking at that complexity and the role that they were often asked to play, being on the front lines of the removal of Indigenous people. And so this project hopes to really tell the full story.
Most of them we'll never know their names or their voices or their stories, and so I'm here in hopes of bringing some of that reimagining, some of that texture to the now.
It was, for me, really exciting to see him include my perspective, the Navajo perspective, into this narrative. And so what that does is it really addresses a lot of the issues around borderlands and how we see and perceive what boundaries are, and then also the effects of those boundaries.
Art is about dealing with the contradictions. It's not about, creating a world that we already know, or creating a world that supports what we already feel and think. So I think the contradiction is essential.
My name is Johnny Taylor Valdez. My great-grandfather was John Taylor. He was a Buffalo Soldier and married the chief's daughter, Kitty Cloud. I never was a slave to anyone. I didn't have to fight for my freedom.
I was moved by the presentation of John Taylor Valdez, the great-grandchild of John Taylor. As an African-American person, learning about someone like John Taylor and just the contributions of people of color 150 years ago, gives me inspiration, gives me hope, looking at what they dealt with and how they overcame it.
This press and all the little presses that operated in all the little towns in the West were almost always run by white people, and power comes from owning the press because you can set the narrative.
These newly free black men joining the service and actually fighting for a country that actually had them slaves, so there's kind of that interesting dynamic going on and how to maybe address that in my work.
The piece that I'm doing was working on today that I came up with when he was doing his prayer, had the refrain in it in a good way. I saw the poetry in it. Very simple, but if I can take that very simple line and complicate it with just a color.
We have people that will want to see Buffalo Soldier representations in a very stoic, clear fashion, one that's very reflective of their imagination of the past. I'm hoping that the artist can kind of distend that and stretch it out.
The land itself has been like a recorder of events. And you may see remnants of that pop up here now. You know, like things might be buried under the ground, you know. So we're still trying to figure out who we are as a people and why we're here, you know.
Looked around the press and thought for the project it would be amazing to have access to these resources from the period and to create work for this Buffalo Soldier exhibition using authentic material from the period, but to do kind of a remix of it.
You know, like the art could be a way of filling in gaps of history. You know, it could be a way of filling in missing pieces. And our lives are like that. When we try to figure out our past and present, our history, our family, you know, you want to try to fill in those gaps. So filling in the gaps of those stories and those things to piece yourself together. And you know, art has always been that way for me, piecing my life together.
John Taylor is my great-grandfather right here, the Buffalo Soldier and Civil War veteran who ended up marrying one of the chief's daughters, and she's over in the corner, and that's Kitty Cloud. The two families got together to, you know, arrange the marriage, and he had been in the Civil War, had already been a Buffalo Soldier, and had been an interpreter for the tribe for a long time. And so the reservation is 15 miles tall, and then it's 75 miles long. So technically we should have a little over 1 million acres, but we only have about 470,000 or something like that. And so we are, you know, we're honored to have two of our great-grandfathers here. So it's just amazing, you know, when you think about it, the history of those Civil War veterans that are here in this cemetery.
Knowing that they had a history of being former slaves, where the interaction primarily with land occurred working the land but not owning it, not engaging with the land in a way that was beneficial for them, and then coming out west and really seeing this completely different landscape, but also being asked to fight in Indian wars where Indians really were putting their lives down to maintain that relationship with the land.
Dear John Taylor, I have a question from the future looking back. Would you agree or disagree that Manifest Destiny was the architecture of doom? Peace, Theodore. So it was just the right amount of words for that space, blew it up.
identified a model who embodied the spirit of the sort of resonant meanings of Cathay Williams as someone who had pretended to be a man and ultimately served as the first female infantry person or any person serving in active duty in the military as a black woman.
This piece was inspired by the photograph you see at the entrance of the exhibit of John Taylor and Dick Buskin Charlie. But here I've taken the two images and joined them together by the legs. Kind of like a play on this idea of this double consciousness or double identity, or these two people being in this area and the roles they have to play in the expansion of the Western frontier. So these two works is probably kind of mounted on the wall, kind of like the wheelbase of a mountain bike. And as you can see, these two pieces were inspired by this photograph here. Kind of play on this idea I was saying earlier about this idea of double consciousness, where you're aware of your black identity, also your American identity. So you're living in these two worlds and trying to navigate that.
So this piece is the 25th Infantry of Buffalo Soldiers. The upper brass approved the possibility and experiment of using bicycles to transport troops.
And I was particularly interested in the portraiture of these soldiers and different characters that tell the story, collaging them, creating different context for them in terms of backgrounds.
I was interested in how different people related to land within this story. Photographers who came out west to try to encourage settlers, white settlers, to move out here.
I understand the still blue sky don't warm the bones of an uncooked country. What if the country is not a country but a dirt pile waiting in our blood? I understand wanting to give in, the sleepless midnight, the beckoning star, the country a civil stew of heat and unrest.
I created a series of missing posters and land for sale posters. The missing posters were really to address the history of missing and murdered Indigenous women from the beginning of colonization. The silhouette is of me, and I asked some colleagues and other friends to write descriptions of me if I went missing. I think my biggest hope for this show is for people to understand their role in this narrative. And I think people often, because of different types of privileges, can excuse themselves from roles. And, you know, I'm hoping that this exhibit will really ask people to figure out where they are on this continuum of shared land and shared space.
Okay, thank you, Taylor, so much for that. So that's our short film we have, and we'll just give it over to you, Eric.
Oh, you're muted, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. I just realized that. Okay, is that better?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen here. Yeah, hopefully that film was able to give folks kind of an overview of the project. And, I think it's really wonderful to be able to hear directly from the artists themselves. I'm going to share a little bit of background and then before we open it up to some questions, just to provide some information about the origin of the project. The name of the presentation here, we titled History, Art, and Place. And so I want to talk about all of those elements and how they really have inspired and informed this project, but, even more, comprehensively the work that we do at Fort Garland. And so we'll dive into that place aspect first. I'm not sure how many of you have been to Fort Garland, but Fort Garland is in southern Colorado in an area of the state known as the San Luis Valley. It's where the red star is on the map that you see here. And the valley is really interesting, as is alluded to in the film. The San Luis Valley is at the intersection of several homelands and sacred spaces to Indigenous peoples for time immemorial, including the Ute, the Hickory Apache, many of the Pueblos, the Dene, and others. But the valley is also considered the very northern edge of Spanish, the Spanish colonial territory until Mexico gained its independence in 1821, and then the valley, transfers hands to Mexico, and then in 1848, at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the valley becomes part of this new western part of the United States territory. Even when the valley becomes part of the United States, as this map alludes to that you're looking at, it actually is in New Mexico territory. So I tell visitors to Fort Garland all the time that the fort and what remains of the fort actually predates, Colorado in many ways. And so I think that's important because, Esther talked about this in one of her portions of the interview, is that we really are in this borderlands region. And so that informs, I think, this project and other projects that we do in a pretty big way. Fort Garland itself was established in 1858. I mentioned the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I'll talk about that in more depth in a second, but Fort Garland is established in 1858, 10 years after the treaty is signed, as part of this American westward expansion process. This is new American territory, and so one of the ways the United States begins to occupy this new territory is through homesteading and giving land away out west, but also through the establishment of military forts throughout the Southwest. And so Fort Garland is part of that, history. It's situated in not just a really significant geography, but also in a really significant time, in this geography. So when I talk about the history of Fort Garland and its role in the valley and in the Southwest, Fort Garland is established during, right in the center of this 20-year period in this region that has substantial consequence for the people living here in the area. I mentioned the treaty a few times already, but exactly 10 years before the fort is established, you've got the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The reason that is significant is that prior to the fort being established, there had been some of the earliest Spanish settlements emerging during the Mexican period here in this region. And so when that treaty is signed and this becomes United States territory, it means pretty drastic changes for the Spanish-speaking population in the area. Exactly 10 years after the fort is established, the Ute Treaty of 1868 is signed, that treaty results, effectively in the removal of all Ute people from the San Luis Valley. Of course, while this is, Spanish territory and Mexican territory, it really is predominantly Ute territory. There's a significant population of Ute, in the area traveling to and through, the area. And it's that treaty that's signed, 10 years after the fort is established, which was really the purpose of the fort, was to, quote unquote, deal with the Ute population and pave the way for Anglo expansion into the West. So, if we think about it in this 20-year time period, there's significant changes here in this region. Just to give you a sense of, the way that is being viewed by people of the time. One of the things that Fort Garland is most known for is that Kit Carson was stationed here. He was in command at the fort from the middle of 1866 through 1868. And when he arrives at Fort Garland, he writes a report about Fort Garland and the San Luis Valley and things happening in the area. And this is one of the things that he writes here. He says, "It is here that the last wave of Mexican semi-barbarism meets the advancing tide of American progressive civilization, producing as it may be a clash of languages and laws and customs, a diversity of mistrust and influence, which renders the presence of military surveillance and police both necessary and judicious." So, even I think from this language here, you can get a sense of the way that, these new, certainly the military, but other Anglo settlers viewed, the existing Hispano population here in the area, and some of the tensions then that even the emergence of the fort would create in this region. In 1868, after the Ute Treaty was signed, you get a different perspective of, of this new, reality in the area. Because after the treaty is signed, or after the Ute Treaty is signed of 1868, there's a delegation that goes to Washington, D.C. And, Chief Uray shares, this statement or something similar to this. He says the agreement the agreement an Indian makes to United States treaty is like the agreement a buffalo makes with his hunter when pierced with arrows. All he can do is lie down and give in. Again, I think it gives you a sense of the tension and tragedy of this new reality in the valley, which I think is also representative of other conflict throughout the Southwest during this period of time. So these are other things that happen. This is also there's a lot of things happening nationally and regionally during this time period. I mentioned some of the earliest Spanish speaking settlements emerging. We also, of course, during this period of time, there's a breakout civil war. Colorado Territory is established, south of us in New Mexico and Arizona. You've got, Carson's violent campaign against the Dene, leading to the Long Walk. Later, it's after that conflict that Carson is sent to Fort Garland. And then separately, also in 1866, this Army Reorganization Act, which I'll talk about later, establishes the all-Black military units that were that are known as Buffalo Soldiers. So there's a lot happening both in the Valley, but also nationally, that are informing, and that will inform, and impact the future of the Valley for years to come. So fast forwarding a little bit past that period, the fort was active as a military unit until 1883, so for 25 years total. After that, the fort was abandoned. The buildings were used for a variety of purposes, as you might imagine during that time period. These well-equipped, buildings, aren't just going to sit vacant. They are used as housing. There was a general store in one of them. But by the early 1900s, the fort, the property at the fort begins to fall under disrepair. Buildings start to crumble. I didn't mention this prior, but many of the buildings are adobe constructed. If they're not cared for, then they're going to begin melting away to the earth, which is certainly what started to happen here at Fort Garland. I always say, fortunately, there was some citizens in the Valley with some foresight to think about preserving some of the buildings, and there was an effort in the early 1900s then, to raise money and begin this preservation effort. That happened through the 1930s and 40s. The original vision for the property was to open up as what they were calling the Fort Garland Fairgrounds. But with the Great Depression, it made fundraising difficult during that period. And ultimately, the property was handed over to the State Historical Society of Colorado, now known as History Colorado, which operates the museum to this day. The site opened as a museum in 1950. And the original vision for the museum was to operate in the house style museum way, in which the idea was to give visitors to the San Luis Valley and the Fort Garland a sense of what maybe daily military life would be like at Fort Garland. And really, we operated that way for almost 70 years, from 1950 until about 2017-18, when we really started to dig in and really try to think about and reimagine the future of this space, and also make an attempt to tell a broader narrative, in collaboration with our community and others. Because the reality is, like, when I stepped into this director role, which was in 2019, I heard, frequently from community members, especially those connected to this land, for generations, those, Hispano families who have descendants still living in the area, but also Native peoples connected to this area that, either living here or outside of the area, who said point blank that the fort and the museum, never felt, welcoming in that prior interpretation. And so, we've done a lot of work to really try to think about, how we tell the stories of this place, in hopefully a more meaningful way. And so, to give you a sense also of the past interpretation, I mentioned Carson's role here at the fort. Of course, Carson arrives to Fort Garland, after his violent campaign against the Navajo. And really, he's tasked with the same thing. He's tasked to, quote unquote, deal with the Ute of the area. And so you'll get a sense from these photographs. The photograph on your left, the black and white photograph, is an image that is in our History Colorado collection, dated early 1960. It gives you a sense of the interpretation at that time when the museum opened. So you've got a full-size mannequin of Carson sitting at a desk there. This scene that you're looking at is intended to depict treaty negotiations with Chief Ouray and other Ute people. The photo on the right is an image of the same interpretation in the same room, almost 70 years later. This photo was taken in 2018 in April, before we deinstalled that exhibition. And so you get a sense of how little things changed, for the first, 68 years of the museum's existence. And I like to share this example just to kind of give you a sense of, the visitor experience here. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. That, I think, hopefully will provide a context of both the military's, the fort's history as a military installation, but also as a museum. I want to shift to this project, our Buffalo Soldier project, and talk a little bit about why, that is important. As I mentioned earlier, the 9th Cavalry of the Buffalo Soldiers was stationed at Fort Garland from the very end of 1875 through through most of 1879, so about 3.5 years. Buffalo Soldier units were established in 1866, and I think it's worthwhile to note, just because we're close to the anniversary date, that Army Reorganization Act that established the Buffalo Soldier units, which originally were the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and also the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st Infantry. These were the first, all Black peacetime, military units established by the United States government. That act was signed on July 28th of 1866. So I mentioned that because we're just a few days from the actual anniversary. So this coming Sunday, we'll be acknowledging the 158th anniversary of the signing of the act. It was actually in 1992, what was that, maybe 30 years ago, that President Bush signed or acknowledged and established National Buffalo Soldiers Day. So that was one of the reasons why we selected this day to give this particular presentation, just because of the continuity, of the history of both the signing of the act, but then also the establishment of the Buffalo Soldier Day. But it was, like I said, in 1875 that Buffalo Soldier units were sent to Fort Garland. And so what we're looking at here is an image of Fort Garland and 9th Cavalry members at the front of the fort, which at the time was facing south. And, by the time that the 9th Cavalry arrives at Fort Garland, it's almost, 8 years after that treaty of 1868 that I mentioned earlier. So by the time that Buffalo soldiers arrive at Fort Garland, the Ute have already been removed, from the valley, to the western slope. And, from that point forward in subsequent years, Ute lands would get smaller and smaller, I think, as we all are aware. And so what's interesting about the 9th Cavalry while they're here at Fort Garland is that they actually play an interesting role, in this region, because they're not necessarily on the front lines of removal per se, but they actually play this role of both keeping, Ute people out of the valley, but also, attempting to keep Anglo settlers, miners, other settlers, off of Ute lands on the western slope. And so if you can imagine what it might have been like to be, an African-American soldier during this time period, immediately post-Civil War, trying to keep, Anglo settlers, off of native land, I think is really interesting dynamic. And so I think that those relationships and, that role in all of the ways are reasons why we were interested in digging into this history. And so they give you some context, here in the fort. This image that I'm sharing here is a flag that flew at Fort Garland during the time the 9th Cavalry was here. I share this image because we've got a reproduction of this flag in the installation. You may have seen it in the background during the video, but I like to share this flag because I think it is interesting for a few reasons. One is, if you look closely and count the stars on the flag, you'll notice that there are 37 stars, or were 37 stars on this flag. Why is that important? Some of you may know that Colorado is the 38th state. So I think, when we think about westward expansion and manifest destiny and colonization, if we think about the fact that this flag flew on the parade ground here at Fort Garland, in land that we now, call Colorado, it's interesting to me that that Colorado is not represented on this flag. And so I think it, offers an entry into conversation about again, the fort's role in this region. The other thing that's really interesting and compelling to me about this flag is that, Colorado gained statehood on August 1st of 1876. It was actually Buffalo soldiers that were here during that time period. And so I think it's interesting also to think about, the fact that it's African-American soldiers that are raising the flag immediately after, statehood. And so I think some people probably know here on the call that, we're 2 years away from acknowledging the 150th anniversary of Colorado statehood and the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so, as we plan at Fort Garland, for exhibitions and public programming to acknowledge that history, thinking about how, this flag, can tell a lot of different stories, connected to that history. So I just think it's again, as a museum person, a really interesting, artifact and tool to be able to enter into that kind of conversation. I want to be thoughtful of time. So I want to run through real quickly the revision exhibition. You all met Chip in the video. Chip was our lead artist. We actually worked with him in 2021 for this first time on an exhibition called Unsilenced that explores the history of Native American enslavement in Southern Colorado and the San Luis Valley. That's probably its own presentation, so we won't go too much into that, but it was actually through that collaboration and through that work that we began talking about Buffalo Soldier revision. Chip was interested in this work, and I couldn't tell the story probably as good as he could, but I've heard him share it many times, so I'll try. Chip himself, he grew up in the South, in North Carolina. He went to medical school, became a doctor, and ended up, participating in one of those programs where if you serve in an underserved area as a physician, then they'll pay for your medical school. Well, he ended up being placed in Arizona on the Navajo Nation, and he anticipated being there for just a few years before, basically to fulfill his obligation before moving on. And ultimately, he spent over 35 years there. He just retired last August, working for Indian Health Services on the Navajo Nation. While a physician, he also became this nationally and internationally recognized artist that does a lot of photography, and then I guess he would call it street art, murals, really celebrating the history and the beauty of the Navajo people. And so he was interested, as a Black man living in Indian country for 35 years, he was interested in looking at this history of Buffalo Soldiers and the role that they played in the West. The way that he tells it, he said he was interested in, looking at that question as to what would compel a formerly enslaved Black man to participate in this Manifest Destiny, project. And so that was kind of his inspiration for this project. He approached me about opening or working on this exhibition, which we, of course, were all in on. We gathered a team of artists, again, many that you met in the video there. We brought them to Fort Garland a year prior, so in June of 2022, to see the space, to meet with community members, to meet with Buffalo Soldier descendants and historians, as well as other tribal partners and others, and spent time here in the Valley and also in the Four Corners area. Here's some of the meetings that we had, folks that attended those gatherings. While in the Four Corners area, we spent some time in Mancos at the Common Press, and you got a sense in the video of the role of the press. The interesting thing about the press is that it was at its heyday, active around the same time that the 9th Cavalry stationed, first here at Fort Garland and later at Fort Lewis in Durango. And so it was really compelling to us to think about how we might use equipment from that time period in this exhibition. You saw our trip to the cemetery there in Ignacio. I'm just going to fast forward through a few slides because I want to be able to get to some of the Q&A. But we met with our artists via Zoom for the year leading up to the exhibition, and ultimately, what we opened was the exhibition description that you saw in the video. And we titled it Revision for two reasons. We looked at it with two different definitions, if you will, thinking about revision as the act of updating or correcting, so really adding more to the story, if you will, but also the act or power of seeing the future with renewed vision or imagination. So envisioning, if you will, what this history, what our reality could be, if we look at this history through a different lens. This is an image of the building that the installation is in. It's the West Officers' Quarters. It's a building where officers and their families would have lived. Part of the reason we chose this building is because at the time that the 9th Cavalry was here at Fort Garland, Black soldiers were not allowed to rise to the rank of officer. And so this is a space that 9th Cavalry members would not have occupied. And so for our artists and for those of us at the museum, it was a reclaiming in many ways. And then I've got some images of each of our artists that we'll just acknowledge by name, and then I'll stop sharing so that we can go to Q&A. But Chip Thomas on your left is an artist who's currently in Flagstaff, Arizona. On your right, Andre Leon Gray, talented artist from North Carolina. Theodore Harris is a Philadelphia-based artist. Of course, Rosie Carter currently lives in Cortez, there in the Four Corners area. Esther Belen and Gaia. Esther is in the Four Corners area as well, I think near Bayfield, whereas Gaia is in Baltimore. And then Mahogany Brown, who is the inaugural poet in residence at the Lincoln Center in New York City, but originally from California. And then Tom Judd, also a Philadelphia-based artist. And Alan Dominguez and Raul Paz are filmmakers of the film that we saw. So I'm going to stop there only because I want to make sure that we take time for some questions and answers from the audience. I'm sorry that if that felt rushed. It's a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time.
Thank you, Eric, so much. And also co-moderating here, we have Rebecca or Becky Hammond, who has a personal connection to this history too. So she's here as well. So yeah, we can jump into some questions. We have someone who is curious about how soldiers interacted with Indigenous people and communities in the area.
Yeah, I assume that like during the time that soldiers were here, well, it was, there was, so here in the valley, so Fort Garland, where the fort was at, there wasn't any, direct like conflict or battles or things like that. But we do know, through oral history from both, U partners, as well as some of the Hispano residents in the area, that tensions, were high, during most of that time. There is a Indian agency here in Conejos County that was in our neighboring county to the west. Today it would take, maybe 45-minute drive. Back in the day, it was a longer trip, of course, by, by horse or otherwise. But, with the establishment of the fort and the establishment both of the Indian agency, both of these entities were in, I guess had, frontline contact, with Native peoples. And like I said, the original purpose of the fort was to deal with the Ute, right, to pave way for Anglo expansion. So, there was, I would say violent, interaction, but not in the sense of like a battle or whatnot. There are stories of, when, while treaty negotiations were happening, that rations were sent to both Fort Garland and the Indian agency to be dispersed to both Ute and Jicarilla people. But we know also that there are stories of officers in particular or individuals at the agency, pilfering, some of those rations and not getting, those to the people. So yeah, so it's a complicated, kind of history here in the area. So, and then after 1868, again, based on some of the history that we've heard through both oral history, but also documentation, this is when, peoples are removed from the valley. And so, we heard a story from a descendant who said, if you were Ute in the valley after the signing of the treaty, then you were forcibly removed out of the valley, or worse, right? Maybe, murdered or, taken captive or whatnot. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to follow up with a question that's related. Someone here is asking, how do we hold space? And I think a lot of us are always asking ourselves this question, especially those of us from marginalized communities, but yet still involved in sort of communicating histories of others. And so they ask, how do you hold space for diverse communities on sensitive yet critical subjects when tasked with communicating history that is not your own?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And one of the things that we try to do is like create space for for those conversations, both in our research and preparation, development of the exhibition, but also like post opening. In both, I've talked about 2 exhibitions, Unsilenced and also Buffalo Soldiers Revision, which are both exhibitions that have opened the last 3 years. And in both of those examples, we were really intentional around bringing community members, particularly those directly impacted by this history, to the table, to have conversation and dialogue that ultimately we hope like informs the project. So I mentioned, 12 months prior to the opening of Buffalo Soldiers Revision, we brought our artists here, and it was to view the space, but also to engage with community members, to hear from them the significance of the history, to hear from them, what are the key, elements. And while we didn't necessarily require ongoing conversation with the community from our artists, like we maintained, of course, that communication, but I was really pleased that many of our artists did, maintain communication with both Buffalo Soldier descendants in this case, and also some of our tribal, partners, and often shared back some of the ideas, that were emerging, and I think all of that informed the space. And then within all of our spaces, once we open, we also try to create space for reflection and participation from community. And on Silenced, we've got a reflection room with a journal where folks, can share, their thoughts or their connection to this history. In Buffalo Soldiers Revision, you may have seen an image of a tree with postcards on the tree. Rosie, who was the creator of that exhibition, created that, and it's a beautiful interactive where she asks a prompt, basically land is, and invites visitors to reflect on, our connection to land and the meaning of land. And then people can write their response and their reflections on these historic photographs of, the region from that period, and then hang that photograph with their feedback, on the tree. And so it's, we call it kind of a living exhibition, living space where people can interact also and share back, with the exhibit, but also with others.
All right, thank you for that. It sounds like a really, I don't know, an incredible space or opportunity to provide spaces for healing as well. And you sort of touched on that a little bit, talking about where the exhibition is. So, yeah. Let's see here. Is this a permanent exhibit, or is there a planned end date?
There's not a planned end date. We consider it a core exhibit, so it's one of the anchor exhibits currently here at Fort Garland. At some point, it might be replaced, but not anytime soon.
Okay. And we have a few more questions in the chat, but we're running close to end of time, and would like to give the space for Becky here.
No, it was actually one of the questions that it asked about the number of men in the company that was there, the Buffalo Soldiers.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So at any given time, there was typically between 40 and 60 Buffalo Soldiers here during that period that they were here. So.
Okay, and then I know you had like the different numbers of different troops, but the name Buffalo Soldiers, which just became like that's what everybody says now, and not like really who they actually were, kind of thing, instead of a troop. So you get like, Custer's company, other stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting because it's just kind of like this because of who they were, type of thing. So
yeah, and unfortunately,
I think it's interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of names of troops stationed here at Fort Garland. We know the officers, but the records that we have, only give us numbers of troops. you know, someone, we would have their name if they got in trouble, if they, you know, maybe deserted, or if they were reprimanded. But interestingly, you know, Buffalo Soldier units typically deserted at a much lower rate than their white counterparts. We know that this is like national data. You know, we look at the national history. When we learned that, we went into our records to see if that was also true at Fort Garland. And during the 25 years that Fort Garland operated as a military installation, there were over 460 deserters during that time. That's about 16 or 17 per year. Of 9th Cavalry members, there were no deserters during the 3.5 years that 9th Cavalry members were here. So, you know, that national, you know, knowledge also applies to Fort Garland, which I think is really interesting.
Well, do you think it was because, I mean, where would they go?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a big part of it. If we think about many of these soldiers are formerly enslaved, you know, what we know is that, you know, we wanted to, Chip was especially interested in that question, like what would compel, you know, a formerly enslaved Black man to participate in this, to you know, enlist in the United States military, right? But it often came down to, this was one of the only opportunities that, you know, African American men had to provide for themselves and their families. So, you know, after having experienced enslavement or life, you know, prior, the military probably didn't seem so bad. I think the other thing is exactly what you're saying, Becky. Like, where would someone go? If you were an Anglo deserter, you could probably blend in into a local community a lot easier than if you were an African American deserter, right? So
Yeah, and then, you know, because, you know, we get, you know, later on down the line, when you're, because we're pointing out John Taylor wasn't from that company. He was from somewhere else who eventually moved to the area, right?
exactly, yeah. Even though we use him as a really great vehicle to tell some of this history and story, especially when it comes to relationships between African Americans and Native Americans in this region. He actually wasn't stationed at Fort Garland, but he ended up settling in Colorado. So he's still, you know, we claim him still as a Colorado story.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you so much, Eric. Really great presentation. We have a lot more questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So feel free to reach out to Taylor or one of us or Eric. And yeah, just thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. And we'll see you soon.
Hey, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, everybody, for the opportunity.